Andy, thanks very much indeed for the opportunity to be on this panel. And I've been asked to, as Andy indicated, perhaps to set out at least a beginning of a conversation about what are some of the new models. And although the title of this is Model, I think it's really about models for different growth paths, which would be very different from the ones which led us into this crisis. And as a way to get the conversation started, I was asked to present some of the elements of this book, Exiting the Crisis, towards a model of more equitable and sustainable growth, which really was a collective work of a lot of individuals. Some of the authors are in the room, so I'll be very careful about what I say, but also really a number of the international trade union organisations, TUAC, which I'm responsible for, but the ETUI in particular, who published the book, Andy himself, who was one of the key editorial team, David Coates, who edited it, who was originally with the UK Work Foundation, and the International Trade Union Confederation. We really pulled in a number of very interesting contributors from the South. Just to what I'll try and do very quickly, and as a lot of issues have already been put on the table this morning, particularly in the session on inequality, I'll skip over some of the slides rather rapidly. But first of all, explain what we were trying to do with this book. And then run through the overall policy approaches, what some of the priorities are for, and then focus particularly on labour markets, but also more balanced growth, regulating finance, and then a word or two about, hopefully in discussion with you as well, about where we go from here, how we take some of the conclusions forward. The reasons for starting this work. Were that, I mean, in 2008, the international trade union movement really was focused very much upon the immediate jobs impact of the economic crisis. And jointly, we were putting regular statements to the different G20 meetings. We still are. At the same time, as well as trying to protect jobs, trying to help our affiliates and their members and their families sort of struggle through the first impacts of the crisis, and also put on the table issues for re-regulation of finance and other points. I think we're all conscious that the sort of policy frameworks which come out of this crisis will really influence the lives of the next couple of generations very clearly, the sort of rapport de force, the sort of social balance in society. And I think that general realization is even more, I think, vivid today when you look at the capture of the policy debate, in some senses, by the populist right, as opposed to what many of us thought, that this would naturally lead sort of policy conclusions for a progressive centre-left to sort of fall into our laps. That certainly hasn't happened. So again, the issues about articulating alternatives is crucially important. In some senses, I'd say even more important now than when the work got put together. But we basically did a sort of open source approach of inviting our affiliates to around 5 or 6 themes of what we perceive to be the causes of the crisis, or at least had the roots in the growth model which led to the crisis, the imbalances of that system: finance, real economy, income distribution, environment, economic growth, north-south, importing countries, public-private sectors. Those imbalances which have been in the previous growth model, to say, well, look, around those themes, who's going to volunteer to write some essays, really, about what you would see as being the alternatives that we can put on the table and get a discussion forward. And what was interesting, I think, that 30 people actually did contribute on a voluntary basis. That means there's some gaps in it, and there's some gaps in what I'll say this afternoon. There are certain areas, clearly, which need to be more developed. But it really got a process started of about 30 people who were prepared to write something, which was, I think, produces a credible set of arguments about what some of the alternatives for a progressive approach can be. The starting point was that market fundamentalism has failed. And again, driven in producing this work, I was struck by two conversations. One with one of a relatively progressive ambassador to the OECD who said, okay, well, you're very good at criticising what the neoliberal or neoclassical model that the OECD comes out with. Well, what are your alternatives? So it was a response a bit to that challenge again that we went to our affiliates and said, come up with some of your thoughts. But secondly, it was a conversation with Joe Stiglitz just when the Institute of New Economic Thinking was set up, funded by George Soros, in that he was concerned, and Stiglitz was one of the key authors involved in that process. Stiglitz was concerned that this was going to be funded essentially by financial organisations, and he wanted to get some trade union resources into this project. So in the conversation with Stiglitz, I said that trade unions giving money to George Soros was certainly new thinking, but I couldn't see it happening very quickly. So we thought at least we'd try to get these ideas on the table and get a piece of work together. The main thrusts were certainly, on the one hand, challenging the ideological arguments. On the other hand, challenging the argument of coordination. What really should be the way of trying to put in place international responses. Prior to employment, the concern about now the shift we've been discussing this morning back to austerity policies, the move away from lightly regulated financial markets, and a central point about reversing the rise of income inequality. And indeed a realization that some of the lessons are not just in Europe, OECD countries, industrialized countries, but there has been some interesting successes, for example, the Brazilian contributions, which may give policy lessons elsewhere. From those ideas which came out of the conversations, the book's been structured around six main sets of issues. Firstly, the purposes of economic growth and measurement. The need to go beyond just GDP per head, but along the lines of also some of Stiglitz's, Fitoussis and Sen's work, to actually get a broader dashboard of indicators and integrate those into economic policy making. Ensure that the generation of demand, which is strikingly missing at the moment, but in the more medium term is sustainable. Central to that, ensuring that employment policy and labour markets ensure that wages rise in line with productivity, and that the growth is more broadly spread also globally in developing countries, and really a horizontal issue of sustainability, both the environment, which I know is on the next panel, so I won't say much about it, but also in terms of the nature of enterprises, corporate governance and labour markets, moving to a long-term approach. Just to focus for a moment on the labour market and inequality, and build on perhaps some of the conversation just before lunch on inequality. Before the crisis, in the debates with the OECD, we saw some sort of shift away from the 1990s model of deregulated labour markets. Not as much as we would have wanted, but whereas in 1994, when the OECD put forward its job strategy, the central ideological thrust was let's go for US deregulated labour markets. This is what creates jobs. Europe has failed in job creation. The US has created these millions of jobs, and that has to be the approach. By the revision 15 years later, the reassessment in 2006, there was an acceptance that there are different models which actually can deliver high employment performance. And on the table, juxtaposed against the US deregulated labour market, was for want of a better word, the Nordic market of strong labour market institutions, redistributed taxation, strong welfare states, and narrow income inequality. The debate then with the OECD was very much, whilst of course anybody can copy the US model, the Nordic model costs a lot of money, you have to have high taxation, may only work in small countries, so maybe it's not going to work. But that was the debate we had there. But I think what was interesting was the fact that income inequality, which we were just discussing before lunch, and as you heard a presentation of part of the OECD work in the area, did become an issue, and perhaps in response to Philippe's question this morning, does this matter? An inkling that not just for social reasons, but actually because this may be a real weak spot of an economic model which was in other ways seen to be performing, may economically be both non-sustainable and actually problematic. You've got a lot of figures this morning. This is the one which you're all familiar with, coming from the OECD work of the, on average, 10% rise in Gini coefficients between the the 1990s and the mid 2000s, but with, as was already pointed out, different groups of countries. And whilst even the Nordic countries have seen this increase in inequality, what's strikingly significant that the Anglo-Saxon countries, and particularly the US, have been the ones with high inequality which have seen increases as well. The actual developing OECD countries, Turkey and Mexico, have seen some small falls. I've cut out quite a few tables which are in the book on inequality. We've got some important information again this morning. But just to pick on a couple of features of that change, one shouldn't underestimate just how much the top 1% in the Anglo-Saxon economies particularly, although Argentina's there as well, are now what I would call looting, if you like, social assets, or actually income which is redistributed. And indeed, you can go into much more detail of looking at the top 0.1% of the US high-income earners just to see exactly what is going on. And I was on a panel in Davos, of all places, a couple of weeks ago, discussing corporate remuneration. And, there were 70 billionaires in Davos, and it was a bit of a strange conversation to be having with, these people in the room who are agonizing over why are they getting so much money, and shareholders are not doing their job to restrain us more. But it's an interesting conversation which is now entering in. Another feature which perhaps wasn't touched on this morning, but this is the 100 is the wage shares in 2000 here. Here you see by different regions the fact that on a global level there's been something like a 10 percentage point shift from wages to profits over the last 2 decades as well. And with the exception of Central and Eastern Europe, you can see that's been pretty consistent across different regions, but also very significant in some of the areas and indeed in the OECD countries. What one might argue is under past experiences you would have seen these two lines. These are capital shares on the right axis as a percent of GDP, and investment as a share of GDP on the left axis. Prior to 2000, those two lines were pretty well coexistent. You can argue about which way does causality go, but this was a sort of standard growth model. What you saw in the 2000s was, I would call, a growth of a rentier economy, where the gap between investment and actual capital income just dispersed. I had another slide which for brevity I've taken out, showing the growth of also dividends as a share of total profits. But again, you can see the fact that that what I'd call a rentier economy had its origins in the sort of deregulation and growth of inequality that we'd seen building up over the 1990s. Now, just to build a little bit on what was said, I think we can all take, skill bias, technological change for given. But in the end, when you look at the OECD work, and this is some work these are some conclusions coming from the ILO, which we quote in the book about the causes. I'd say the smoking gun on all of this is a combination of the financialization economies, which I said I think was a link to what we've just seen on this rentier economy developing, and actually the deregulation of labour market institutions. I've, over the last 9 months, read many versions of the OECD's report, Divided We Stand, which was presented this morning. And when I read the first draft, which the Secretariat produced last April for an internal discussion, I mean, I was late at night in the office, and I just sort of, was absolutely kind of bowled over, because the smoking gun was saying inequality is inextricably linked to the deregulation of labour markets, which the OECD itself has been proposing and recommending for the last 15 years. Now, you may not have heard that in very explicit terms this morning from the young colleague from the OECD, but it's buried still in there. I think it's page 80. You can pull it out and you can get it. But this is still the truth which dare not speak its name yet in the policy conversations in the OECD. And you can imagine it's dynamite, because at what point do you draw the conclusions when you say that inequality is important? A very significant cause of it has been the weakening of collective bargaining, the weakening of minimum wages, the weakening of employment protection legislation, and draw conclusions about how do you reset some of those institutions to balance up the questions of inequality. That requires a bigger push and a collective push, which we're now in the process of trying to take forward. But it's a key factor. But also, as seen, the question of less progressive taxation, the question of global economic uncertainty, and the broader lack of jobs. And this mirrors also ILO findings. I think one significant element, which is now very interesting, is that if you read, and again, if you look at quite a few of the slides which came up this morning, source was, Luganini from the IMF, he's one of the co-directors of the IMF Research Department, and we've been working together on a number of different projects. But the products coming out of the IMF now, or their research department, the model about the fact growing inequality in the US actually contributed to the financial bubble. I mean, it's not rocket science. There's more people, poor people, trying to keep their living standards up by wanting to borrow money, and lots of rich people looking for new interesting ways to make lots of money with their savings. You've got deregulated financial intermediaries. It's not a Nobel Prize winning project to put those two things together to see that you get unsustainable bubbles and unsustainable credit bubbles appearing. But the fact they're putting that on the table is interesting, together with the other arguments and material about the lack of durability and sustainability of growth in high-income countries. So economic arguments, not just social arguments about why inequality matters. So in terms of solution, normally, the arguments have gone in the OECD, well, it's a question of just, you take what the market gives and then you try and deal it with on social or political judgments on tax or social expenditure. And certainly you can see the relationship between social expenditure and reductions of Gini coefficient, which still does exist by and large. But you'd need, for example, for the US to get back to 1980s inequality, to spend 8.5% of GDP on social transfers, which isn't going to happen anytime soon. So I think it takes us back to what a large theme of the book is about how to build the labour market institutions. I would add minimum wages, but also collective bargaining as a central factor, well-set hiring and firing regulations, as well as active labour market policies, some of the things put on the table this morning, and above all, core labour standards. And again, look at the chapter on Brazil in the book, because as well as having growth, they managed to reduce the Gini coefficient by 6 years, by 6%, in 6.5% over the last 10 years. So all of the solutions don't just lie in the north. I'm run out of time, but other issues in the book about the right settings for a more stable macroeconomic policy, what that then means, and indeed, obviously, the re-regulation and breaking up some of the political and economic power, which we've seen so evident of the financial sector in the last 2 years in the efforts to re-regulate tax the financial system. To conclude, I just say that the debate is now really open, and in the short term, so many of the policies are obviously going in the wrong direction, that I think the question is also strategically about precisely how do we steal the high ground. I think two compelling cases is that, strong labour market institutions reduce inequality, and inequality was one of the key causes of the crisis. It has to be in the centre of the political argument now. We have to bring that back. But then I would say the other argument, and I was really struck by what was said at the beginning this morning about, the German model. Let's tell the truth about the models which have worked during this crisis as well to keep people in jobs. And at the beginning of the crisis, the OECD, the IMF were saying, well, we'll see employment bounce back very quickly in the US, and it's going to be the Germany, probably the Nordics, some of the continental countries in Europe which are going to have disastrous unemployment problems. The opposite has happened. I mean, US unemployment is now at, although it's now falling, still at what would have otherwise been regarded as politically unacceptable levels in the future. And despite, as was very clearly said in the presentation this morning, internal flexibility in the German model has been the real miracle of the crisis, just as I think many of the low inequality North European countries are also in a strong position. And, debt didn't cause the crisis caused debt. So we're going to be campaigning. I was in Japan last week. We launched a Japanese edition of the book. We're trying to build up with things like the Institute of New Economic Thinking networks, working not just with allies, but also people who disagree and try to take these debates forward. But I think, the argument about not leaving the victors of the crisis to be, won by the populist right is an extremely important responsibility that certainly all of us in this room and the trade union movement share. So thanks very much.